Morning all. There are many weird and wonderful and fantastic games being played all over the place at the moment. Michael Adams has just done brilliantly at Dortmund, which has just finished. So this is one of the games. Adams was playing black against the German #1 player, Arkadi Naiditsch, 27-10. So Adams is 27-40, the British #1 on the FIDE rating scale. Let's have a look at this game. I think it's an interesting demonstration of how isolated queen's pawns can cause what can seem to be sometimes a self-destruct mechanism. If you remember in films like James Bond films, there's a self-destruct of the evil empire at the end as James Bond is escaping. So let's see to show you what I mean. So d4 from Arkadi. Naiditsch, and Adams plays knight f6, c4, and now e6. It looks as though it's going to be an interesting Nimzo engine, but after knight c3, Adams plays d5. He doesn't even play bishop b4, he just plays d5. So a classic Queen's Gambit declined position. We see bishop g5, bishop e7. This looks absolutely classical here. Live book indicates knight f3, the most common move, is played. And now knight bd7, one of the more common moves. The most common is actually h6 with 4,800 games castling, but Adams played knight bd7. It doesn't look too terrible for white or anybody at the moment. So e3, the most common move. And now we see Adams kicking the bishop with h6. Castling or c6 is also two very common moves here, but h6 prompting the bishop to do something. So where does the bishop want to go? Let's see, bishop h4 is the most common move, and that was played. Bishop f4, much rarer actually, 23 games compared to 328 games for bishop h4. Bishop takes f6 is also very rare. Giving up the bishop voluntarily in this position is only 3 games. So bishop h4, so we're on a beaten path at the moment. Black castled, and now bishop d3 is played. Now this might be significant for the theme I really want to highlight here. Bishop d3 is played. More common seems to be rook c1, just waiting perhaps for d takes c4 for the bishop to be able to take on c4 in one go. So the German #1 player doesn't mind, it seems, losing a potential tempo with bishop d3 here. Also queen c2, again waiting for d takes c4. Can this really be of huge significance? Okay, let's see. So bishop d3, d takes c4, so okay, a loss of tempo, no big deal, surely. Well, okay, but what is occurring soon is that white will have this isolated queen's pawn. Sometimes maybe a key tempo here and there could make the difference between the isolated queen's pawn being an effective resource for, say, putting a knight outpost on c5 or e5, rook lift in the future. The isolated queen's pawn will happen when black plays c5 and cd. And Adams, for the moment, no, he doesn't play c5 immediately. He plays a6. Okay. And that gives the option, of course, for b5 and bishop b7 to do something about this otherwise problematic piece stuck behind this pawn. a4, clamping down on b5. Okay, is this position quite rare already, in fact? Well, now we are getting quite a rare position, but it has been seen before with c5 being played 15 times according to my live book. So c5, white castles, and we have c takes d4. Now, I think, boringly, there has been one game with knight takes d4, and I say boringly because then we would have a completely symmetrical pawn structure. If we look at the pawn structure on knight takes d4, I guess that's equal. More excitingly, e takes d4, 17 games. So it has been seen before. And now this battle of the isolated queen's pawn. Why should the isolated queen's pawn lead to any desperation on white's part? Well, it's been a big theme on this channel, the perks for both sides of the isolated queen's pawn. Black's perks, this blockade that can be set up sometimes on d5. In the end game, sometimes you can have a king crawling later on d5 to c4 or e4. You can have the rooks like this. It can damage that potential pass pawn, so black can sometimes have a pass pawn somewhere else. So the end game often favours black with the isolated queen's pawn. But in middle games we sometimes see even just this diagonal being very dangerous for white's king. But from white's perspective, the isolated queen's pawn provides these hooks for c5 and e5. It provides this e file for rook lefts, or maybe even the c file. So general attacking opportunities. But can it actually cause psychologically a self-destruct mechanism? You see, the thing is, sometimes if we're given this rather blunt view that the middle game favours white and the end game favours black, then it creates a psychology sometimes of desperation that white needs to somehow attack at all costs the black king, and within that desperation can be this kind of self-destruct mechanism. So let's see. Knight b6, bishop d3. For the moment, okay, is bishop d3 actually, we're still in book? Actually, it's a rarer bird. The bishop dropping back to b3 is 15 games. Going to d3 is just 2 games. It looks as though it's been slightly casually played now with bishop d3, because this looks like an ideal blockade scenario after knight bd5. It gives black also an option for targeting this pawn at some point as well, if he wants to temporarily fix white's isolated queen's pawn but give a backward c pawn instead. That's also an option. But is Adams actually interested in knight takes c3? We see knight e5, so white's using that attacking perk, that knight aggressively. But this bishop not on this diagonal would seem maybe a shame if the blockade could be cleared up. Sometimes, liberating that with d5 or the bishop on that diagonal. But it's on this diagonal which seems, potentially dangerous, and the knight's eyeing a soft spot here. So is this all bad? Has this actually been seen before? Now we're out of book. I'm going to switch on a Kibitzer here. Okay, black really doesn't want to fix white's pawn structure. He wants to keep that isolated queen's pawn and actually grab that potentially dangerous bishop. I guess, potentially white might be threatening moving the bishop back and then creating a battery on this h7 square at some point for bishop takes f6 or knight d5 bishop f6 to be an option. It should be noted here, with this h6, black doesn't really want to create any more weaknesses than necessary around his king, so he goes for the attacking bishop. If he can get rid of white's attack, then this structural weakness is a problem. He's also threatening, no, he's not, of course he's not threatening queen takes d4, pardon me, because a bishop h7 check, which will discover an attack on the queen. So queen takes d4 is not a threat. The main threat here is just getting rid of this dangerous bishop. It goes back to b1. Okay, and now interestingly, you might think, well, b6, no, b6 looks as though it might be playable actually, because knight c6 is covered by the knight. The bishop could develop like this, but an alternative way is bishop d7. Black doesn't mind the knight perhaps taking here. If knight takes here, queen takes, we're just left with this raw isolated queen's pawn without any nice centralized knight. And if white's unable to construct the battery on h7, then it seems this pawn is really just a sitting duck here in this position. The engines really actually like black here, thinking black's got an absolutely great position. It's just not too much to worry about as far as king safety. So let's have a look. So we see bishop d7, that's left. In fact, white uses this seemingly aggressive attacking resource, which looks fairly nifty at some level, to play rook a3. Sometimes we see this in Kasparov-Karpov games, this rook a3, some classics with the rooks shifting over for an attack. And it would seem thematic that white wants to go for black's king. But in doing this attack, have we set off a self-destruct sequence for white? If the attack fails, what will be left of the position? We see now bishop c6, again asking, does white really want to take on c6 here? Are these pieces really getting misplaced if this knight has to make way for the rook to swing across? This looks as though it's all really quite aggressive, but there's still this structural issue which is still left in the position. And if white takes, let's say taking on c6 again, black could even consider, from an engine point of view, even b takes c6. What would that do? It really fixes against d5, And this pawn really isn't a target because white hasn't really got the pieces available to make this pawn a significant target. So maybe even b takes c6 is playable, but simply knight takes c6 might be okay as well, unless bishop takes f6 and d5 here. So this could be a way of getting rid of that isolated queen's pawn. If white can dissolve that, this is about equal actually. And there's even queen c2 here. This is a game. So maybe the intention was actually to take with the pawn. It seems a little bit more solid against d5. Ideas of bishop f6 and d5, but it wasn't taken. White gets knight e2 in to be able to swing the rook across, which looks really aggressive. But is it aggressive or self-destruction? I guess it really depends what concretely can be achieved. Not just in principle. It looks aggressive in principle to have all these pieces attacking the king, and with the rook left, it looks, in principle, visibly very aggressive. But also, look at black's rooks here. What can black do? For the moment, they're just sitting in their default positions, and actually, it's this e5 knight which is challenged, knight d7 for Michael Adams, offering exchange of bishops here. With this knight on b4, this battery concept is out of the window for the moment. Black is offering the bishops and it's taken. Queen takes e7, and now this seemingly aggressive rook g3. Okay, now you might think, well, knight takes e5, is that tempting? It does remove the isolated queen's pawn. It's next to the other pawns potentially for f4, f5 maybe in the future as well. This position, I think, is potentially quite dangerous for black. White cannot be that much worse here. So that isolated queen's pawn is left alone for a moment. We just see rook fd8. So is this rook actually worth more than, say, this rook? This rook is classically targeting the center and actually creating a concrete threat now. Knight takes e5. And this rook is just more a caveman rook. And this rook is in its default position. This rook's in its default position. Is there a rook superiority overall? It depends on the specific threats that can be achieved against the black king here. We see queen c1, so creating a threat of queen takes h6. Okay, so this has to be parried, and Adams plays king f8. And now it seems, again, this offering to take on e5. Again, I wouldn't say, sorry, knight takes e5. It's not actually black's turn, but does white want to do anything about it? No, he doesn't. He plays bishop h7. Okay, so knight takes e5 here needs to be considered. Knight takes e5 again here. Again, doesn't really, although it seems to be getting rid of an aggressive knight, it might lead to a position where there's even a check here. This is quite okay, I think, for white. It's absolutely okay. So nurturing the isolated queen's pawn, we see knight f6, and also, of course, this bishop is asked, maybe to go back here. The funny thing is, the bishop didn't take the opportunity to go back here to b1. But in this scenario, there's a problem here. This a pawn from earlier, which let the rook in, is at some cost. Bishop takes a4 might actually be playable here. If there's no concrete threats to black's king, this might be okay. So maybe this has now put off, going back to b1. And I think we well and truly have gone into the self-destruct sequence. So trying to get this aggressive rook in, a slight symptom of that is this a pawn. And this bishop, which is usually a problem piece, is now targeting to win a real pawn. And, okay, what does white really want to do? He doesn't want to play bishop c2, surely. Rook ac8, beautiful rook there, targeting the queen, because the queen wanted to go on the attack as well. So it's also kind of not in an ideal position for rook c8 here. So what we see here is actually knight f4. Leaving the bishop on h7 for the moment and generating the threat of knight g6 or knight g6 just to fork the king and queen here. So this is the threat. And now we see Adam's doing a retreating move to parry this threat, bishop e8. But this knight has left the d pawn here. Doesn't white have to fear now losing d4 or the other threats? Well, again, this bishop is now also hanging, so doesn't have to be moved back as top priority as well. Bishop b1. If bishop b1, though, we lose d4 here, and this looks actually quite unpleasant to lose this centre pawn here. For example, knight f3. We can put this other rook here, and these rooks look absolutely quite beautiful. And look at, white's rook seems to have, being hard coded for doing something which it wasn't doing. So white's essentially a rook down the centre, and these key files in this position, as well as a pawn down. After knight bd5, it gets even more miserable. So, okay, we see bishop e8. The bishop doesn't really want to retreat, losing d4. So we have a problematic position now. In fact, the top engine move, one of the top engine moves, is actually to play queen c4 here. So what's the idea? The idea is to offer the bishop here for knight eg6 check, knight takes e6 check, and the queen at least might have some opportunity to do some damage here, like knight takes d8, this position. But black is okay here, even though it seems a bit scary. Black should be okay. But queen c4 wasn't actually played. We see actually the move rook f3. So what threats does rook f3 carry? Well, it seems Adams didn't see too many and just challenged the knight on e5 now, as well as the pawn here. So if he had taken with rook takes d4, let's see what can go wrong here. Maybe queen e3, the rook goes back. It starts to look a little bit dangerous like this, but it might be tenable, but it looks just a little bit dangerous on the dangerous side. So Adams actually just played knight c6. He's trying to extinguish white's attack. Knight takes d4 will be more powerful than rook d4, chasing away the rook if it had any intention, aggressive intention there on the f file. Okay, white now, after knight c6, in fact, this is actually the top engine move as well, knight c6. What are the major threats? Well, knight takes d4 as mentioned. Rook takes d4 as well is also an option, because that pressure on e5 is significant. But knight takes d4 is the main threat. White actually plays, pardon me, in this position. White is in a bad state now, in a really, really bad state. So Adams hadn't greedily taken this pawn. He's just going for that centre pawn all the time, allowing the white pieces to kind of be misplaced to target his king. What does white actually do now? Well, he plays rook d1 now, just letting the d pawn go. So rook takes d4 is played. Let's have a quick look if knight takes d4 was an option. If knight takes d4, maybe rook fd3. And this is less unpleasant for white, I think, in this position. But it's still unpleasant for white. But we see rook takes d4 instead, which is maybe even better. So rook takes d4, finally winning that isolated queen's pawn. So the question now, has white completely self-destructed here? He takes on d4, knight takes d4. After rook d3, this bishop is actually stranded by its own rook, and Adams simply plays knight c6 now. And you'll note something horrible about this position, as well as losing the centre pawn, is this bishop is hard to get out. It's been trapped. White's trapped his own bishop. White actually resigned here on move 26. If white plays knight takes c6, for example, bishop takes c6, black is simply threatening knight takes h7, to which there doesn't seem to be anything to do. He's just losing a piece for nothing. I thought this was quite vivid for how white can go into a self-destruct mode from just having a simple, issue, this isolated queen's pawn, some slight, tiny, inaccuracies, giving, black a very comfortable position. The tactics, just led in this particular case to losing a piece, that, trying to generate some concrete tactical opportunities. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.